Welcome back to Avero TV. I have with me Robert Kornovich, Vice President of Client Success, which means he is responsible for all things project delivery. And today we want to touch on a topic that we have been dealing with and working with a client on for a few months now. It's a very large ERP implementation. Vendor's been selected, and we've been working on contract negotiations with this vendor, not just the software provider, which is a very large publicly traded company, but also the systems integrator, which is also a fairly large organization. So all in all, this project will be about $10 to $12 million for a large organization in the US. And Robert has been primarily the lead on this negotiation process. And it concluded, as far as I know.
We're at a good point.
We're at a good point.
We don't have signed documents, but we're in a much better spot.
But the terms and conditions have been agreed upon and they've been ironed out. Now, why did it take, 3 months?
Yeah.
Right? When a client says, we want to award you this contract, dear vendor, shouldn't that be it? And they should be like, thank you. Where do we sign? But It took 3 months so far.
Yeah, and really what it boils down to is the vendors seem to have this impression that everything is going to be this long-term dance, either because that's what they've experienced before or they figure that's their best strategy. Don't know. But this is a particular case where the client was very clear on what they wanted. I mean, extremely clear on what they wanted. Yet the vendor insisted on doing this back and forth of, okay, well, we see your revisions. Well, we don't quite agree with them. We have some alternate ones, or in some cases, they would ignore those revisions and not respond to it, and then you have to follow up with them. To some degree, some of that is to be expected in a negotiation. I think what the problem this vendor ran into specifically, and it almost cost them the entire thing, was this concept I've talked about before of a shared fate. When you approach a client like we do, where we share the risks and the liabilities with you of this project, we share the same fate in this, the client knows that when push comes to shove or when the project gets difficult, we're not going to go, hey, sorry, completely out of scope, or that's not defined in the SOW, or we never agreed to that. Or if we see a risk for us, we don't automatically run to a liability protection mode. Right? Now, we have to some degree because we're a business. It's important to do those things. But when you start taking some of these tactics, you signal to the client immediately that when push comes to shove in this partnership, the software vendor or the implementer will protect their interests over the client's interests. And again, from a business perspective, I can understand that, but nothing will get a client to be very concerned about what they're getting into with you when you start signaling things like that. I think that's where this really went off the rails, because then I had a client that went, wait a minute, I don't know if we should even continue with these folks. Let's go look at our number two, because these people make me think that if something doesn't work in this project, they're going to walk away from us and take all of our money.
Yeah, it was a question of good faith, right? It's if you're pushing back on trivial language that may not ever happen. That's what contracts exist for, and that's what lawyers exist for. But this is beyond the terms and conditions. Sounds like for a while there was no consensus on what these words should mean, nor was there any dialogue on why the vendor would not agree to a certain question or change that the client was requesting.
Yeah. And we even ran into a situation on this one. What we generally see when you go into contract negotiations with a vendor or implementer is it's usually the sales and implementation haven't got their facts straight, right? We're used to vendors coming in, doing a sales presentation. They promise everything in the world. Of course, the software will do this. Let me show you this new shiny report, even though it's not the report your client specifically asking for. Implementation gets handed the scope and goes, wait a minute, the software doesn't actually do that. We never promised it would do that. That was not the case in this situation. It really was sales and implementation fighting their own lawyers internally. And when you get lawyers from the vendor on the phone with lawyers from the client, things really start to devolve fast, because you're exactly right. It'll start going into arcane legal terminology or situations where the probability of them happening are, 1 in a million, literally 1 in a million. So if you let it get to that point where you've got lawyer upon lawyer arguing terms, you'll never get through negotiation. Some people will tell you, You should walk away in those deals. Well, if that's the case, none of these deals would ever occur because there's always legal counsel telling you what your best interests are and what you should do to protect those. So again, you don't need to ignore liability and enterprise risk that comes with these projects, but you have to find a way to be careful with your message to a client that if things become problematic or there's an issue, we will be here to take care of you. That our first concern is going to be for you, the client, not what is our legal exposure.
Yeah. So what were some of the terms that they were either party was being sticklers on, right? It wasn't money. You would think in a $12 million deal that you're haggling over pricing of the licensing and how much you're charging per hour or per module, but money, I don't think came up very often.
Yeah, actually, the price itself and the overall cost and the cost bridge and everything in the BAFO, these were rarely discussed. A lot of it came down to liability. That actually would set the tone for the entire thing. Either they want to say that the client has completely unlimited liability in the situation, but the software vendor has no liability on anything whatsoever. You have a lot of clients that they've looked at other entities like them and they've seen them in the newspaper for a failed ERP implementation where they paid all the money up front and they got nothing. Clients are very concerned about that, especially with governing boards. They do not want to be in the paper for something like that. So when they see language that basically says the entity or the housing authority has completely unlimited liability on this, but as a software vendor, I have no liability whatsoever, that becomes a major sticking point very quickly. I think the scary thing for me is we know clients that are not as sophisticated because they don't do a lot of procurements along these lines. I really worry about someone taking advantage of them in these situations when they either don't have good legal counsel or it's very limited or it's way overused, or some procurement departments don't even worry about the legal aspects of it. I worry about vendors out there potentially trying to take advantage of that, and that's what really bothers me about the entire situation.
So let's chase that down a little more. When you talk about liability, is this me as a client saying if your software doesn't work for a certain period, for a certain module, for a certain function, that I can claw back the fees I've paid you, not just for implementation, but also for licensing? And I'm saying that to the provider of the software, but also to the system integrator.
Correct.
Okay.
So we were able to structure, in this particular case, we were able to structure it so that the software provider, rather than doing auto renewals on the agreement, we set it up so that every single year this entity would have the option of looking at where they are in the project and deciding, is this not going well? Do we need to stop here? Because there are software providers that they will not allow termination for convenience at all, or termination for non-appropriation when you don't have your funding to be able to follow through. The implementers usually will have language like that to be able to protect you to some degree, but this software providers, the big players out there especially, they want their money, and they're not unclear about the fact that that's what they're doing here. Is they're offering you a good price for a long-term deal because they want their money, and you are obligated to pay for those 5 years or 10 years. It's a reason why one of the first things we say when we talk to potential clients is we would love to take a look at these contracts for you and just give us some of our advice based upon experience, because a lot of times it boils down to these simple things that occur that usually stop the negotiations, or the client wasn't even aware that they were getting into a 10-year obligation on a piece of software that if they wanted to walk away in year 4 or year 6, they were not going to be able to do that.
The money. So what was your team's role in this negotiation? We're not lawyers, right? We had to bring in lawyers to look at it from a legal perspective when we were looking at the contracts for the 17th time. But tell me, or tell the audience about what our role as consultants was in this whole negotiation process.
I would say informed, experienced middle persons, as well as trusted advisors for the client. So I would not make decisions for the client. The client always is in control. I think it's another thing that's important for people to understand during the negotiation process is you're the one paying the money. You are very much in control of this process. So exercise that control. So it was guiding the client, giving them some options, some recommendations, our viewpoint, sometimes straightforward, honest discussions as to this is why this is not going to work. But the client's always in control. They tell us what the outcome they want to see and what they want to do, and we would dive into details if it's appropriate. But a lot of these folks, especially on sponsorship, are tied up doing 35 other things. They're not going to stop and read a 117-page SOW. So even the areas where we would mark up in an area for the finance director to look, areas where we wanted the HR director to look at the scope of work, areas where we wanted procurement and legal to work. And that way they can just focus on an hour or two of reading through the documents and looking at the sections that were relevant to them, rather than trying to get 40 pages in before you get to something relevant. And by that point, your mind is numb reading these documents. And at the same time, using our power and experience as consultants and experienced project managers and portfolio managers to know when to push back directly with the vendor. So that way there isn't time wasted with having to get sponsorship to meet with a software vendor to determine something that I could very easily put into words that I knew the client, that's the end result they want to see. And then I could get that from the software vendor and just save a lot of time and be efficient with sponsorships, availability, and attention to the project.
So what other aspects of this contract were sort of prickly?
Definition of deliverables. Definition of intellectual property is an interesting one. PII, if you're an organization that has PII or HIPAA, defining how is that data going to be protected and kept secure. And going back to the liability or even just the problem-solving aspect or the curing process if there's an issue, we had an implementer and a major software vendor pointing fingers at each other when we asked, well, who do you call when this doesn't go right? And they would point to the other person. So even just solving the ability to clearly have someone that you can pick up the phone and say, this isn't working, I need help, I have serious concerns, and knowing you know exactly who that person is things that a client likes to see. So sometimes those details seem unimportant to a lot of vendors. They're very important for a client because, again, this is what gives them assurance that they're not going to be in the paper and they're not going to have a failed ERP implementation that has their name all over it. And in the particular case of this was a particular person's legacy in the organization. They did not want to leave the organization until they had them on a modern ERP system that worked and that was going to be something that was going to be part of their lasting legacy as to what they did for the organization.
So when you say shared fate, you kind of tune into that, not necessarily hot button, but motivation for the client to do this in the first place, because this is a lot of heavy lifting towards the end of your career, and do this right, because that is what they were going to leave the organization with as their legacy. So does that resonate with you as you're trying to negotiate with software vendors? And I guess in this case, you didn't see the same reciprocity from the vendor group.
Yeah, I honestly don't think software vendors or implementers, I hate to say this, I don't think they even care about the legacy aspect of these things. They see an ability to get a big project and someone they can use as a client reference and someone that's going to be able to pay their bills. And I think they see the practical side of the business aspect of it more than they do the client side. I think it's the reason why a lot of people hire us as well. I was in local government. I was always looking for someone that actually had my interests in mind as well, not just automatically putting up a wall and delineating things. Because really, again, when it comes down to it, I think the reason why clients are willing to stay with the vendor long term is because they feel taken care of. You can handle the technical aspects of things. You can put together a great project plan, great communication plan. You can have successful UAT. You can have successful go live. And if you haven't built that relationship, especially one of trust with the client, they don't want to work with you ever again. They'll say, thanks for getting us live on this new ERP system, but we've got it from here.